Okay, I think we're on. I'm Ed Commentali, Director of the Indiana University Arts and Humanities Council, and also the Associate Vice Provost of Arts and Humanities at IU Bloomington. I'm glad we're here. Sorry, we had a small technical difficulty earlier in the evening, but we're ready to go, and we're really excited to present this program. I hope people are coming back to watch us. Please do what you can. Start a watch party. Get your friends to tune in. We're really excited for the discussion tonight. This is sadly our last episode of Quarantine Conversations. This has been a really important and successful program for us, and we're really excited about the response that we've received and the viewers that have tuned in, students, faculty, alums, community members, people from all across the country really have been watching with us, and it's been very rewarding to us to share our work in this capacity. All the previous episodes of Quarantine Conversations are available online at the IU Arts and Humanities Council webpage. Look at artsandhumanities.indiana.edu and you'll be able to find them there. Quarantine Conversations is a discussion about COVID-19 as well as all of its social and cultural and historical impacts and resonances. It's a program that really showcases the arts and humanities as essential disciplines for understanding and exploring and living through the current pandemic. We've heard from historians, literature professors, philosophers, religious studies professors, people in critical race studies, medical humanities, as well as artists, actors, singers, musicians, playwrights, and novelists. And we've learned so much about the disease as a pandemic, as a global pandemic. And we've also learned so much about why the arts and humanities matter at this time, how these disciplines can provide equipment for living, so to speak. These are essential disciplines, and they're absolutely vital to our health as individuals and as members of a broader community. I'll skip a lot of the pleasantries because I want to get started and introduce you to our guests. I just want to say quickly that my co-creator in this series is Jason Kelly at the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute. Jason and I have been working together to make sure that this is a cross-campus initiative and showcases the good thought of our colleagues at both campuses. And we've also been working closely with Indiana Humanities, our state humanities institution that's been providing support for humanist inquiry across the state of Indiana. Tonight's topic is race, nation, and the politics of the plague. And this is a really important topic to us, one that we wanted to make sure that was part of the program from the start. It's clear that the current pandemic, particularly in our country, is bringing really significant social and political issues to light. It's putting pressure on our communities and institutions and exposing biases and inequities in new ways. Really, at the same time, it's making clear that ideologies of race shape how we understand the plague and the science that surrounds the plague. Ideologies of race and nationhood are the lenses through which we interpret the origin of the plague, its spread, its impact, and they've been shaping our responses in many different ways, in many different chaotic ways. All this to say that I truly believe, and I think our guests would confirm that issues of race and nationhood are not ancillary or secondary to the experience of COVID-19 that we're all undergoing these days, but issues of race and nationhood are just essential and constitutive to the event as a whole. And so I'm really, really pleased and proud to present my colleagues tonight who will be addressing this important issue in singular ways. One last thing just to know about this program, we've asked every speaker to begin with an object, an everyday object if possible, one that will help ground their intellectual approach in the everyday world for all of us. And throughout the course of the series, we've explored many fascinating objects, a bell, a skull, a poem, a computer simulation, a map. Tonight's discussion begins with a can of Spam. This is just an interesting feature of our program that I'm hoping that you could pay attention to. So our first guest this evening is Ellen Wu, Professor Ellen Wu. Ellen is an associate professor in the Department of History at IU Bloomington, and she's also the director of the Asian American Studies program. Her research explores issues of race, citizenship, and migration through the lens of Asian American history. Ellen is an incredibly influential scholar, and her work is very important and celebrated justly. Her first book, The Color of Success, Asian Americans and the Origins of the Model Minority, tells the astonishing makeover of Asians in the United States from the Yellow Peril to model minorities in the middle decades of the 20th century. And her current book project, Overrepresented, places Asian Americans at the center of the intersecting histories of race-making, policy, and democracy in the age of affirmative action. Ellen's talk tonight is on racism, racial production, and the experiences of Asians and Asian Americans in a time of COVID-19. Welcome to the program, Ellen. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ed, for that very generous introduction. So hope you can all hear me. I am, as promised, going to start with my object, which is this, a can of Spam, right? So let me just tell you about this very precious can of Spam. Right at the beginning of the COVID-19 lockdown, I went panic shopping at the nearest big box store. And I was worried about the supply chain. So I grabbed everything that I thought my family might need for the coming weeks. Paper towels, pasta, a Star Wars jigsaw puzzle. But as I raced my overstuffed cart down the canned goods aisle, I made an unsettling discovery. And that was that Target was out of Spam. Now, how could that be? My zip code in Bloomington is full of hyper-educated, I would call them white and or bougie people, the kind who insist on eating organic or local. And so I've never gotten the vibe that cans of Spam, and I would say its underappreciated sibling, Vienna sausages, which are my brother's favorite, I've never felt like Spam are a pantry staple among this crowd, this 47401 crowd. It's too processed, it's too salty, it's too mystery meat. So here we go. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about Spam. Okay? And so I want to talk today about Spam stats and stories, which is a way to talk about Asian Americans and COVID-19. So again, Spam isn't really the food of choice, I don't think, among a more well-heeled crowd, but Spam really means something different for Asian Americans. Now for Asian Americans, even those of us who happen to be hyper-educated and bougie or bougie aspiring, Spam cuts across class divides. It spans linguistic, birthplace, and generational differences. We eat it at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We eat it for after-school snacks. We party with it. Spam truly is Asian American comfort food. We love it in all forms. I think of like Forrest Gump's friend Bubba, but instead of shrimp, Spam. We love Spam musubi, which is in some ways like the king of Spam dishes, which is, I would liken it to like a Spam sushi, or the Korean version, which would be Spam kimbap. We love Spam fried rice, Spam in Hong Kong style macaroni soup, Spam in Hawaii style plate lunch, Korean army stew, stir-fried Spam, hot pot with Spam, Spam and eggs. Our devotion to Spam, that is Asian Americans' devotion to Spam, has even spawned a cottage industry of knockoffs targeting Asian markets. Like these pictures I literally took at the local Asian market down the street. Okay, so I think before going on, I want to define my categories of analysis. I'm going to put on my humanities hat and ask, as a humanities scholar or a teacher might, what do these words Asian American comfort food even really mean? Humanities nerds, we really love to, define our categories of analysis. So I think for comfort food, we can all relate to that, I think, pretty easily. It's the tastes that ground us, that remind us of home. Comfort food is what we might select for an imagined menu of our Last Suppers. But I think it's really the other half, Asian American, that's a lot more slippery. So what is Asian American? I would say Asian American is a burning question that has propelled and perplexed many of us for more than half a century. Asian American is a riddle that we keep trying to solve in search of answers that make intuitive sense, but also empirical sense. Asian American is a case that we keep trying to make to persuade ourselves and other people that Asian Americans exist, and that this sense of being and moving through life is meaningful, that it matters beyond the individual, that it matters in a collective sense. COVID-19 has spotlighted Asian American identity in ways that are both discouraging as well as encouraging. And so for our quarantined convo tonight, I want to just pose a couple of questions that go together. So the first is, what does it mean to be Asian American? And why does that matter right now in the middle of our global pandemic? And I think to tackle these questions, I want to backtrack to what I would call the origin story of Asian American identity. So Asian American, quote unquote, is a relatively recent invention that sprung to life during the social upheavals of the 1960s and the 1970s. Now, the chances are good that you've probably never heard of the Asian American movement. I would say it's probably the least known of the 1960s social movements in US history. And to understand where it came from, we have to know there were two key inspirations. The first was the Black Power movement, and the second key inspiration was the opposition to the Vietnam War. Now, the Asian American movement took off in the late 1960s and lasted through much of the 1970s. It spread nationwide, and it included both people who lived in working class, urban, ethnic enclaves, as well as young Asian Americans who were on college campuses. So these were people of Asian ancestry, mostly young people, but also elders, who energetically worked together to denounce racism and imperialism at home and abroad. What they were really calling for was justice, liberation, and what they called revolutionary change. Now, the Asian American movement championed solidarity with what they called the third world, or third world peoples everywhere, and they really pushed for more equitable and just ways of living. So they described their movement as one struggle, many fronts. And I'm just going to give you a few images of some of the fronts I think that were really significant. So for example, the Asian American movement generated a robust new press and new forms of media. Here's a Ghidra magazine that ran out of Los Angeles for 5 years between 1969 and 1974. The movement produced a lot of vibrant artistic production, literature, theater, music, film. The movement involved campaigns for affordable housing, for healthcare access, and social services for the poor and the elderly. So here we have images from the International Hotel, which was like a single room occupancy hotel in San Francisco. And many activists worked to defend it from being demolished and having the elderly Filipino and Chinese residents evicted. And they eventually lost that battle. The movements also fought for bilingual and what they called community relevant education. Students at San Francisco State College kicked off the longest student strike in US history between 1968 and 1969. It lasted 5 months, and it gave birth to the first school of ethnic studies in the country. And among all the ethnic studies includes Asian American studies, which is what I work on. The Asian American movements also fought for affirmative action and equal employment opportunities. So here's one image from New York City in 1974. Asian American movement activists also demanded accountability for police brutality and racial profiling. So again, another image from New York City, this one from 1975. And much of the movement of the energy of the Asian American movement was devoted to ending US military intervention in Southeast Asia. Okay. So I would say that the loving desire to what they called serve the people we might call it mutual aid today, tied all this activity together. So Asian American identity itself emerged and flourished from this grassroots awakening. By rebranding themselves as Asian American, these early adopters shed humiliating insults such as gook or Jap or chink or even Oriental, these insults that were burdened by toxic histories. And movement activists really hoisted Asian American as an umbrella term encompassing various ethnic communities. So at that time, this meant Filipino, Korean, Samoan, Japanese, and Chinese. And before long, through the 1970s, they widened that Asian American umbrella to include what they called the Indo-Chinese, which were the refugees fleeing devastation in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, as well as South Asians from India. Now, this roundup might seem arbitrary at first glance, save for the geographical proximity of where these people came from. But this collective identity of Asian American actually made sense. It made a lot of sense to movement participants because the histories of these different groups fit similar patterns. And that pattern really was that nexus between the United States empire, capitalism, and white supremacy. So as Asian and Pacific migrants, that came to the US, they were displaced from their homes. And those displacements had resulted from upheavals in the market economy, displacements from wars, and from the United States' imperial ambitions in the Asia-Pacific region. These migrants were then pulled into the orbit of the United States to feed the country's insatiable greed for cheap and expendable labor to generate profits for capitalists. Now, once they got here, Asian and then Pacific migrants were targeted by oppressive forms of racist hostility. So there were immigration laws that were meant to exclude Asian immigrants. There were bars to formal naturalized citizenship. And there was cradle-to-grave segregation, from housing, segregated schools, segregated employments, bans on interracial marriage, and even segregated cemeteries. Asian immigrants and then their children were subject to what I would call cultural ridicule. On this slide, you'll see an image from a magazine in San Francisco in the early 1880s, a very exaggerated depiction of a heathen Chinese. And this cultural ridicule cast Asians as criminal, as shady, not respectable, and untrustworthy. They were stereotyped as eating gross animals and plants, and there were widespread accusations that Asian immigrants carried suspicious diseases. Sometimes this cultural ridicule also bled into physical violence, arson, lynchings, and other kinds of threats. So it was these toxic histories of similar troubles that created what we might call an unintended kinship that connected these communities to one another as Asian Americans. Yet even as they condemned the nation's ugly practices of denigrating and exploiting people of color, Asian American movement participants unapologetically claimed a rightful place in America. And they did this by insisting on liberation from white supremacy and capitalist profit motives and imperialist wars. They refused to be conscripted as so-called model minorities, that is, well-behaved people of color. And what they upheld was this innovative vision for a society that they wanted to see, what we would call today a social justice worldview. And they imagined new kinds of power and new arrangements of authority and knowledge. And I want to even throw in here data. And I'm going to talk about data in a minute. And the point I really want to make here is that they demanded to recognition and visibility on their own terms. So through steady, if behind the scenes policy work in the 1970s, and this is what I'm researching now, Asian Americans made Asian American and its variants, such as Asian Pacific Islander, they made this concept a widely recognized and meaningful racial category. And what they did was they really pushed government authorities to recognize Asian Americans through data collection. They insisted on being counted as Asian Americans, and it was so important because having their problems documented then could prove that Asian Americans were truly a racial minority group in the United States that needed official attention, and to these movement activists demanded remedial assistance. Okay, that meant social welfare resources. It also meant affirmative action. So just a couple of examples. In 1973, the US Commission on Civil Rights held its first ever hearings on Asian Americans, where they crowdsourced testimonies from community members in San Francisco and Los Angeles. And by 1977, the Federal Office of Management and Budget, right? Seems obscure, but very important. The OMB issued federal guidelines for race and ethnicity policy categories. And it's here in this document that you can see from 1977, circular number A-46, transmittal memorandum number 6, that OMB office declared Asian or Pacific Islander one of the 5 official racial groups of the United States. So it's really thanks to these early advocates, these movement activists, that their preferred nomenclature began to gain a lot of traction. And we see that today. The US Census Bureau tracks Asian Americans. Government agencies, corporations, universities, the media pay attention to Asian Americans. I'll put in a plug here. Even PBS finally released a documentary series called, efficiently, Asian Americans, that just came out this month. And I would say a significant number, perhaps even millions of people, have come to think of themselves as Asian American, even if they don't always agree on who counts as Asian American or what it signifies. It's this kind of recognition and visibility that is the enduring legacy, if also the perennial challenge of the Asian American movement. So this brings me to COVID-19 then. COVID-19 really has become a mournful reminder that Asian Americans don't call all the shots when it comes to their own recognition and visibility. Now, to be visible in American life is a question, I would say, that has particularly vexed people of color, both past and present, because visibility invites both wanted as well as unwanted notice. Okay, so now I think a lot of you might know that with this coronavirus pandemic, it has spurred a revival of what we might call the Yellow Peril, which I think of as a meme or as a bundle of popular ideas in American culture that has, encompasses negative and degrading associations attached to people of East Asian ancestry, assumptions that Asians are foreign or outsiders in a threatening way. And, Yellow Peril ideas have historically been used to justify anti-Asian actions, including laws and violence. So since the 19th century, this Yellow Peril meme has really been spliced into American society's cultural DNA. Sometimes it lies dormant, but it's always there lurking and waiting to be rebooted and repurposed and to go viral when people find it useful for a certain kind of agenda. So, we've seen a rash of anti-Asian hate incidents, hate crimes nationwide, even worldwide, with many people blaming China for the pandemic. Just a couple of examples I pulled off the Anti-Defamation League website, one from Martinsville, Indiana, and I think a very horrific one in Midland, Texas in March, when a Burmese man and his children were literally stabbed at a Sam's Club by a man who, assumed they were Chinese and therefore responsible for the pandemic. Meanwhile, we have leaders, including, of course, our presidents and even Joe Biden stoking fears of China, whether with words and images and tweets and their campaign ads. So what this all is really the latest version of a recurring theme of Asian Americans' social standing, always tethered to US foreign policy and Asia. So I just want to mention that Asian Americans have mobilized quickly in the face of all this, and they have begun a data collection projects, documenting these incidents and hate crimes. And I would argue in some ways that this is visibility and recognition on our own terms. We have Asian American organizers, academics, and journalists. They're gathering, they're disseminating, and these statistics and evidence, and they're making sure that these stories get recorded and told. And what we can really see is that COVID-19 amplifies the stakes of racial data. Racial data really is an accountability mechanism. It's a refusal to be ignored, and it is now literally a life and death matter, especially for our most vulnerable populations, who are really our Native Americans and African American brothers and sisters. So I just want to conclude by bringing it back to Spam. Spam, is this shelf-stable canned meat product invented in the late 30s and during World War II, and afterwards shipped overseas and across the Asia-Pacific region to feed the US troops. Now, Spam worked its way out from military bases into local diets. In the territory of Hawaii under martial law during World War II, locals took to eating Spam after the US government restricted ethnic Japanese folks from fishing the surrounding waters. So these wartime food habits continued to circulate as locals moved around the Asia Pacific and migrated to the US. The migrations themselves often a consequence of war and militarization. So when we eat Spam, that is when Asian Americans eat Spam musubi or fried rice or Spam army stew, we are literally ingesting into our bodies this material legacy of US imperial expansion, military intervention, and racist wars in the Asia Pacific. But we have remade this legacy into Asian American comfort food. We have defined this legacy on our own terms, deliciously and unapologetically. And we might say that COVID-19 racial data collection is a lot like Spam. The reporting, the storytelling, the gathering of statistical evidence of anti-Asian xenophobia and racism. It's taking what's been imposed on us and insisting on making it visible on our own terms. This racial data is proof that we exist, that we matter, and it's a building block for a vision for a more connected, more equitable, and more just future. Thanks for watching.
Thank you, Ellen. Great presentation. And I just want to say that I just really always appreciate the story that you've been sharing with us about the Asian American experience and the politics that surround that. We're really lucky to have you at IU. And thanks for participating tonight. Ellen will be back at the end of the program. And please, if you have questions for her about her presentation, please note them in the chat on Facebook, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. Some are already coming in, and we'd love to see more. So our next guest is Johannes Türk, and Johannes is an associate professor in Germanic Studies at IU Bloomington, and he's also director of the Institute of German Studies here at IU. His work focuses on literary theory, aesthetic theory, the history of German and the European novel, modernism, literature and life sciences, especially immunology and trauma and literature. His work ranges very widely through classical and European thought and culture. But tonight we're going to focus on a strand of work that is really dedicated to immunology, as reflected in papers he's written on health and illness in the past, as well as his recent book on immunity and literature, which concerns the formation of immunological knowledge from Roman law to the biomedical sciences. Johannes, when you start, you might tell us if that book will be translated into English anytime soon. I'd like to know about that. But his talk tonight is about sovereignty, immunity, and exemption from a biopolitical perspective. Welcome to the program, Johannes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ed, for the generous introduction. Thank you all for being here. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to share some thoughts with you about the current pandemic. But I will begin with something very different, and that is with an object before I return to the pandemic. The object is a specific text that I encountered years ago and that I have since taught to many students of the Honors College. And I would like to thank them as well. I hope that one of them is watching us for their generous thoughts that really make me realize what an interesting text it is. From there, so from a text from Greek antiquity, I will go to the question of immunity, and I will then end up with remarks on the current pandemic. And I think that what I would like to show you is that this text in particular can provide a resource for us in order to think, or better think, what is really going on in the present. So let me begin. I will share a PowerPoint that I prepared, and I tried to really keep it as austere as possible in order to stick with the idea of one object with a few additions. So the text I will first talk about comes from Thucydides, who is one of the founding fathers of historiography. Unlike the other major Greek model of historiography, Hesiod, he doesn't write hagiography. He doesn't praise the great deeds of great men. Rather, what he writes about is history as it happened. He is the first to look for historic causes of things, for structural causes. And one of the reasons why he does that is that he was part of the history that he describes. He himself was one of the generals during the Peloponnesian War that his book is devoted to. And his mission, as well as the war, failed. As some of you may know, this war really was the end of classical Greece, because afterwards the city-states were so weakened that the Persians could invade. So it's really a world historic turning point. And I think that is what we find ourselves in today as well. Now, it is also the most famous and paradigmatic description of an epidemic that exists. And that means that later authors, such as Procopius, who describes the Justinian plague in Constantinople that we've heard about in this series, two medieval descriptions, two 18th century descriptions of the plague, two Albert Camus novel from the period after World War II, they all go back to it, and they find in it really a way to shape how plagues, how epidemics look like, how people experience it. And so in that sense, it's really the most influential text on epidemics. It is also, however, and this is interesting and not known by many, the first recorded description of naturally acquired immunity. And if you were to go back to early immunological treatises from the 19th century, when the first monographs were written on immunity, you will find that they actually explicitly reference Thucydides as the first one to make the observation of naturally acquired immunity. Now, this is something that's really hard to observe for two reasons. You can only observe immunity if, compared to another body, one body is not infected. So in other words, you have to observe a mute fact, something that does not happen in comparison to someone else. And second, in order to observe it, you need to observe a repetition that does not happen. So someone who did go through a disease will not acquire it again. So it's a very hard, for us, self-evident, but an observation that's really hard and difficult to make. And Thucydides is the first one to make it. Here we have actually the actual object. A manuscript written in Thucydides' hand does not exist, but this is a 1st century after Christ copy of the text that I will be talking about. Now here is the text itself in a translation into English. And I would just like to share with you the passage on the right-hand side. So in the beginning, he really describes this epidemic. And it's an epidemic that really kills masses of people, that runs through the body. Medical doctors fail. There is really no cure for it. And now in the passage, in the long passage marked in green that I will read to you, he describes the social consequences of the infection. And it's a quite long passage, and I would like to read it in its entirety so that you get a sense of the nuance that he applies and of the different shades of this experience, collective as well as individual. And then I will tell you what I think Thucydides does here and why it is significant for us to think an epidemic. So as soon as they recovered, some were afflicted with a total amnesia and failed to recognize either their friends or themselves. You see, the shapes the plague took were greater than the mind could frame. Not only did it attack each person with symptoms more powerful than the human constitution could endure, but in this respect in particular, it showed that it was a different kind of thing from any ordinary disease. Many bodies were left unburied, but the birds and four-footed animals that fed on human corpses either did not approach the bodies or died if they did eat them. The proof of this is that there was a notable absence of carrion-eating birds. They were nowhere to be seen, not around the corpses or anywhere else. Dogs, however, who lived among people, provided a better chance to see what happened to animals that ate the dead. On the whole, then, this was the course of the disease, though I have omitted many peculiarities that may have occurred from case to case. During this time, none of the usual illnesses troubled people, and if it did, it developed into this one. Some died in neglect, others while being fully cared for. There was not a single remedy to speak of that could be applied to bring relief, because what helped some harmed others. No body type, whether weak or strong, stood out for its ability to withstand it. The disease carried off all alike, regardless of the regimen they followed. The most awful thing of all was the despair of those who realized that they were sick, because their attitudes immediately became hopeless. They stopped resisting and were much more inclined to give themselves up for lost. Furthermore, when people attended to each other, they became infected and died like cattle. This was what did the greatest damage. Either people stayed away from one another out of fear and perished alone, and many households were left empty for want of anyone to care for the sick, or they consorted with each other and died, especially those who made some claim to merit. So now I jump to the passage further down, 52. The basic calamity of the disease itself was aggravated by the crowding of people from the country into the city, especially the newcomers. It was summer, they lived in stifling huts because they had no homes of their own, and the death rate was completely out of control. The dead had fallen on top of one another in their death throes after rolling around half dead in the streets and near every spring in their desperate desire for water. The temples in which they had pitched tents were full of corpses because they died even there. Not knowing what was to become of them and completely overwhelmed by illness, people lost respect for the sacred and the secular alike. All the burial customs they used to observe were thrown into confusion, and they buried their dead as best as they could. Many resorted to sacrilegious burial methods for want of appropriate ones because of the many who had already died in their families. For example, they got a head start on people who had built funeral pyres by lightening them and piling on their own dead first. Or they would throw the corpses they were carrying onto one that was already burning and go away. In addition to this, the plague initiated a more general lawlessness in the city. People dared to indulge more openly in their secret pleasures when they saw the swift change from well-being to sudden death, and from not having anything to immediately inheriting the property of the dead. As a result, they decided to go for instant gratification that tended to sensuality because they regarded themselves and their property as equally short-lived. No one was willing to persevere in received ideas about the good because they were uncertain whether they would die before achieving it. So I stop here. So what you see is really a remarkable and description of an epidemic that actually kills masses of people. And what is really remarkable about it, I think, are at least 4 points. First, the social contact. Any social contact turns into a source of anxiety with terrible consequences. Normality is undermined, or rather hollowed out. Customs are abandoned, and those are social forms that even in the case of individual failure can carry a community and hold the social bond. And in addition, expectations break down so that the action of people really no longer find anything to hold on to. This is why in political science, this text is discussed as well, and it is discussed as the first recorded description of anomie, so of the absence of law, of a state in which, as Thucydides himself says, the sacred and secular laws are both abandoned and no longer adhered to. So this is, I think, why this text is really crucial. It describes an extreme. It describes the impact of an epidemic that leads to the disintegration of the social bond. And I think we have to clearly see and understand that in all its facets in order to see what the threat really of epidemics or of pandemics is. Now, this text has not gone unnoticed. We have Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, who famously writes the Leviathan, one of the founding texts of modern political theory. Now, what few people know is that Thomas Hobbes also is a translator of Thucydides, so that the full edition that was translated into English is actually his translation. And it was the only place, as I said, where lawlessness, or something that Hobbes will describe as a state of nature, occurs in the literary tradition. In other words, when Hobbes talks about the state of nature against which society is founded and that society is supposed to protect us from, where everyone just acts in his own self-interest, where there's no communal horizon that allows for the stabilization of individual experience and integrates it into something that in the end results in a common good, then we have to see that the source of it is really this disintegrating state of epidemic that Thomas Hobbes finds in Thucydides. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why Hobbes translates the text. So therefore, we can say that really the threat of an epidemic disintegration lies at the heart of modern ideas about the state. And it's in fact the only real possible case of a complete dissolution of the social bond. Now let me go back quickly to Thucydides and read to you the short and small passage that I marked in blue here. It reads, "Those who had escaped the disease, however, had the most pity on those who were suffering and dying, because they knew what the pain was like and because they were now full of confidence. You see, the disease did not attack the same person twice, at least not so as to kill him. So these people were congratulated by the others, and in the jubilance of the moment held the vain belief that they would never die from any other disease in the future either." Now, this is the famous first description of naturally acquired immunity, and it occurs in a context where Thucydides is not just interested in the body and its protection, but rather Thucydides is very clearly seeing that the absence of possible protection is really the major political threat that societies face. And so therefore, immunity is in a certain sense the most important guarantor. It's the most important repository that allows us to engage in human communication, that allows us to maintain normalcy in a state of epidemic disintegration. And of course, in today's globalized world, where really we communicate globally, communication is not just happening at a higher frequency, there's also more global interconnections. One can say that this immunity as the possibility to anticipate and be exempt from the threat of epidemic collective disintegration is really more crucial and more important than ever. And I would say it, in a certain sense, guarantees access to global communication without running the risk of death. Now, as most of you know, beginning in the 18th century, something develops that's called vaccination. At first, it's a local practice that's imported by Mary Wortley Montagu to Britain from Constantinople. And then it becomes more systematic when Edward Jenner observes that the cowpox can be used to protect against the smallpox. So that's the first cultural technique of conferring immunity through an act of inserting a weakened virus into the human bloodstream. And we see here Jenner, who really stands at the origin as one of the founding fathers of this technology. And it's become systematic in the late 19th century when immunology is founded through figures like Pasteur, Koch, Paul Ehrlich, Elie Meshnikov. And if we think of Thucydides and his description of the disintegrating threat that epidemics pose, and if we see that Thucydides clearly recognizes that the only way out, the only way to act for the good of everyone to remain normal, so to speak, is to have immunity against the disease, then we can really recognize the enormous importance that really immunology and immunizing technologies really have. And if that was true in the 5th century before Christ, then it is, as I said, even truer today. So this is now the first part. Of course, today's epidemic looks very different. And I have here a few images that actually show, that represent the epidemic to us. I think one of the major differences is that it's really a global phenomenon, not just because of the global spread, but also because of our perception. In other words, what we act on, what politicians perceive as pressure, and what individuals shape their awareness through is media, and what they see are images such as this. And that's an entirely new phenomenon. If we think of Thucydides, then he describes the rumors and the arrival of the disease in his text. But the main scene in which the disease takes place is really accessible through individual experience. Everyone is dying in this particular place through an infection that arrives to it. What we see today is really that you have centers that are here marked in bold, where there are areas that resemble in intensity what Thucydides describes. But for most of us, what is happening in this pandemic is actually that we are onlookers. And nevertheless, we feel that it affects us because it could arrive at any moment and could turn a specific locale into the intensity that specific places such as Spain, such as Wuhan, and others that they experienced first. And this threat, I can show you in the United States, is really, takes on the shape of a wave, right? That in a way has specific locales, but then once it surges to a certain point, the idea is it will lift us all up, right? And that's, I think, what this image here shows you. Okay, so I hope that you could see that. So there's much more to say, but I think I would like to stop here in just pointing out that even though Thucydides is the paradigm, the immunity he points out is something direly wanted, and I think should be part of public infrastructure and accessible to all, because it allows equality among people as participants in global communication. Right? So irrespective of pre-existing conditions, I can engage in communication if I have been immunized. So it's a really, really crucial institutional task to really secure that. And when it falls away, as it currently does under the current conditions, we see that all the inequalities and all the problems and conflicts that have existed all along the way can no longer be tamed. And so that has an incredible force. Now, let me end with two thoughts on biopolitics. Biopolitics is usually understood, coined by Foucault. It exists earlier, but really the famous version is by Foucault, that he says, well, in the 19th century, at some point, governments and institutions, they start to really operate and take into consideration the population as a whole, things like birth rate, death rate, and they start to regulate that in order to make life productive. Later on, Foucault, in some lectures, has a different model of biopolitics that he describes first through vaccination, And there, in a sense, he says that biopolitics also is, in a free society that's mobile, the integration of negativity, and that's happening in inoculation, in order to allow this freedom of movement of liberal societies to continue. And I think that is really the failure we're seeing, and this type of biopolitics that really guarantees equality, communication, and what appears behind it is a disciplinary society again, where we say, well, isn't it much more successful if we control everyone? Isn't it more successful if we track everyone? So you can see that immunity is really the central guarantor that exempts us in advance from potentially disintegrating communicative encounters. And it's therefore, I think, really important for today's world. And I think it's not quite recognized as such, the role that it has. Thank you.
And thank you, Johannes. That was very interesting. I was writing so much, I wrote right onto my voter registration form on my desk with comments and questions. So I'm really eager to return to you at the end of the program. Great work. Thanks so much. Our final speaker for the evening is Michelle Moyd. And Michelle is a Ruth N. Halls Associate Professor in the Department of History at IU Bloomington. She's also an Associate Director, the Associate Director at the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity and Society, and an Associate Editor of the American Historical Review. Michelle is a historian of Eastern Africa with special interest in the region's history of soldiering and warfare. Her first book, Violent Intermediaries, African Soldiers, Conquest and Everyday Colonialism in German East Africa, explores the social and cultural history of African soldiers in the colonial army of German East Africa, today's Tanzania. And she's currently working on a book entitled Africa, Africans in the First World War, which will examine the spectrum of African experiences in the war, especially as soldiers and workers. Michelle tonight is lending her really valuable research and thoughts on topics of survival, expendability, Black life and death, and in COVID-19. And I'm so grateful to have you here speaking tonight, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. So I can't really tell if people can hear me, but I'm going to go ahead and start. Assume the best. Inviting me to do this, and I'm also really grateful to be following Ellen and Johannes. Their presentations, I think, really set me up nicely. So let me dig in. So I was asked to share an object, and the object I've chosen is this. It's a mask. It was made for me by my stepdaughter. And, you know, these are pretty typical now, although 2 months ago they were less so. And I want to use the mask as a kind of a way of thinking through the particular racialized politics that we're seeing in COVID-19 as it affects Black life and death in our country. So, you know, at the beginning of COVID-19 in the US, say in March, at the moment when everybody begins to recognize that we have a problem, you know, the debate about the utility of the mask kind of was simmering for a while in March, and then suddenly it seemed to kind of burst into a wider acceptance. There was initial skepticism and then some wider acceptance. But I think what's interesting about that moment back in March is that you could already see some of the political fault lines that were already detectable in political debate in this country, and some real polarizations already visible. So questions like, should I wear a mask? Can I wear a mask? Do I have a mask? What will happen to me if I don't wear a mask? Those kinds of questions were, I think, on a lot of people's minds, and for different reasons. For some parts of our population, these kinds of questions are more fraught than for others. And what became clear to me early on, and I had my own kind of initial skepticism about the masks in March, was that wearing a mask or not didn't communicate any single unitary message. In fact, on the contrary, its meanings are multiple, shifting, and laden with potential for danger. So I thought tonight it would be worth thinking about why. And in my remarks today, I'll return to the mask as I consider Black life and death in COVID-19. As my title reflects, my talk will proceed in roughly 3 sections: survival, expendability, and Black life and death in COVID-19. So let me start by talking about survival. So I hope you can see there 2 images from one from March from the New York Times, which kind of shows an African-American or Black man riding in a subway car with a mask on and also gloves, pretty innocuous photo. And then on the right, one more recently from mid-April from coverage about Wisconsin's electoral primary. And here again, you see sort of an innocuous picture of a Black man in a mask. I thought I would start actually, since Memorial Day was yesterday, that I would start with a bit of history. And I just wanted to kind of highlight the fact that the holiday that we know as Memorial Day started out as something else. It started out as Decoration Day. And the first one of them that took place in this country was actually in 1865, when African Americans in Charleston decided to give a proper burial to 250 Union dead soldiers who had been buried in a mass grave in what had been a race course that had been converted into a prison. So African Americans in Charleston decided to give these war dead proper burial and to decorate their graves. And as the historian David Blight notes, in doing so, they managed, or what they tried to do was to participate in a kind of new patriotism that recognized their sacrifices and that gave them a stake really in the forward motion of the country in the post-Civil War moment. Later on, memory obscured these origins, along with so many other aspects of Black histories of survival, success, and joy, down to the present. Historians routinely recover and narrate these histories, and those who enjoy the study of history often know them, but it remains the case that the one David Blight wrote about in 2011 in this New York Times piece, following archival research at Harvard, is probably not widely known. Yet it embodies much about what is happening to us in the US during COVID-19. African American appreciation of Union soldiers for their role in emancipation, pride in their own self-liberation actions and politics, and rich sense of the need to mark the passing of the Union war dead all signaled that African Americans were more than ready to take part in American democracy, such as it was. But of course, this was not to be an easy path. So fast forward to 1918, this image and article has recently been circulating on social media, and it shows men wearing masks in attendance at a football game in Georgia. It's a Georgia Tech game in 1918 during the Spanish flu, so-called Spanish flu pandemic. Mask wearing appears to be normalized. Men in military uniform over here sit alongside men in civilian clothes, and people appear largely relaxed. Another perspective on this period in US history is that in this same time frame, the military was mobilizing or was finishing its mobilizations to the Western Front. In late 1918, nurses, of course, were needed to work with and to treat sick soldiers who were returning from the Western Front and other places. And interestingly, these 9 African-American nurses came to be stationed at a base in Ohio, where they actually not only kind of broke, made a breakthrough in terms of their ability to work at all in the U.S. military, but they also treated white patients. And so as a contrast to the photo that I showed you before of what appeared to me mostly to be white men enjoying a football game, we have this really interesting image of 9 African-American nurses who travel to this base in order to treat returning troops who were sick with the flu. Here I'm quoting a historian who is actually at Earlham College here in Indiana, who makes a different kind of point about Black survival in this moment. And what I really love about this is that she points to, again, to women's work, but also makes it clear that Black people were fully engaged in the kind of work that we're seeing outpourings of right now, even. And specifically that Black women in Chicago who were, of course, subject to some of the worst effects of the disease in terms of living in crowded spaces, urban spaces and such. She notes from her own research that Chicago ladies, as she calls them, began to make masks that were really fancy. They were made of delicate lace, exquisite jewels, and that they managed to produce these flu veils, as she calls them, that looked fabulous. And she uses this as a marker of these women's determination and grit. So those are just a few examples kind of cobbled together to highlight the point that I really want to make, which is that African Americans are experts at survival in this country because they've had to be, and that they've often done it with flair, even in the most serious of circumstances. I'd like to move now to talking about expendability. And I shared with the organizers of this set of presentations an article that came out a few weeks ago by Adam Serwer, which is also referenced there at the bottom. And I really think that this piece captures quite a bit that is very important about this moment in terms of why we're seeing things play out the way they are. This quote in particular, I think, highlights Serwer's main point, which is that we're living through something he calls the COVID contract, or we're living in the midst of something he calls the COVID contract, which was preceded by the racial contract, which in theory was preceded by the social contract, which is supposed to bind all of us together in a set of rules and expectations that is based on kind of consent that brings us all under governance for our own good, right? But what he points to here is that the pandemic has introduced a new clause to the racial contract, which comes from the philosopher Charles Mills, where he argues that the racial contract is sort of he calls it a codicil rendered in invisible ink, one stating that the rules as written do not apply to non-white people in the same way, unquote. So, so Serwer here takes it a step further and says that we've gone even further and we are now living in something called the COVID contract, in which, here in this quote, the lives of disproportionately Black and brown workers are being sacrificed to fuel the engine of a faltering economy by a president who disdains them. This is the COVID contract. And so no amount of mask wearing, no matter how dedicated we all are, can overcome structural problems of this sort. To further kind of fill out this notion of expendability among Black people in the United States, this piece came out just yesterday, actually, by Sabrina Strings, who is a sociologist at UC Irvine, I believe, who points to this notion of underlying conditions, particularly obesity, as a factor in how African Americans are, first of all, becoming sick disproportionately in the pandemic, but also how they are in effect being blamed for their own sickness. And this pattern of being blamed for their own sickness has this notion of underlying conditions has counterparts in many other parts of our society, right? So you could think of Black businesses being denied PPP loans, incarcerated folks who receive minimal or no consideration for care under any circumstances, under-resourced, over-policed, often crowded neighborhoods, disabled, elderly, and queer Black people who face additional challenges that increase the likelihood of death because of intersecting categories of expendability. So-called essential workers, of course, many of whom are Black and brown people, which maps onto the many service professions that many Black people occupy. So all of these increase Black suffering, poverty, and death, and it is then often described as a kind of acceptable casualty in this war. What I really like about Professor Strings' quote here is that she begins the article by explaining that, you know, she's in the midst of experts talking about so-called racial health inequities. And somebody asks her very pointedly, why are Black people so sick? And her answer is just as pointed, and she says slavery. And she develops the article from there. But I like the succinctness of her answer, obviously, but I think it also captures a great deal about why it's so difficult for many Americans to comprehend this disproportionate death toll that Black and brown people are suffering. Continuing with the idea of expendability, this is another dimension that I think is worth considering, and this does relate specifically to the mask that I used as my object. So having a mask or not is kind of a question that has multivalent meanings, as I started out with. The point I want to make here is that if you're a Black person in this country, wearing a mask is complicated. So for example, police harassment because of masks, because of wearing a mask can be associated, comes from association in the white imaginary that masks are a sign of criminality for Black men. Or wearing a mask and being asked to perform some sort of friendliness gesture to show that you don't mean any harm if you're a Black person could easily lead to a misinterpreted gesture that could mean the difference between life and death. And what if you don't have a mask? So this quote is taken from a Washington Post piece, also fairly recently. So if you've been following the news, you'll know, for example, that certain kinds of people are over-policed in terms of social distancing measures, and certain kinds of people are barely policed at all. And this excerpt from this Washington Post piece kind of points very clearly to the problem of policing of Black and brown people in New York. And the vast majority of citations that have been issued have gone to Black and brown people, not white people, as it relates to these social distancing control efforts. So in the end, the messaging from our government and our society is quite clear. Black people are expendable in the pandemic. The roots of that expendability are found in the histories of slavery and oppression that created the conditions within which Black people survived, thrived, and overcame. But the risk of expendability is a constant in this country, and the pandemic lays it bare for all who care to see. So I'd like to end by drawing on a different epidemic and on Black experiences elsewhere as a provocation to seeing Black life and death in the midst of COVID-19. In 2014, an Ebola epidemic swept through several different parts of West Africa. Much of the imagery that came to us from that disastrous contagion showed us Black people dying in horrible conditions, the gore of the disease's ravages prominently displayed, the otherworldly PPE of the caregivers also a common image from that time. I've elected not to show some of the more lurid imagery, but this one instead, which actually resembles some of what I've seen here in the US, particularly as it pertains to post-recovery patients walking out of hospitals. These scenes were and are a common practice in global North media, which shows deaths of African peoples without any qualms and minimal commentary or context. Journalists justify the display of these images time and again as being necessary for showing people how things happened, to stir outrage, or at least to give people something to care about, as if people being killed by a horrible disease or in an extremist attack. For example, thinking about the attacks against a mall in Nairobi, Kenya, in Kenya several years ago, isn't enough to care about. But COVID-19 has created a different kind of visual culture, which rarely, if ever, shows sick or dead bodies. Instead, we see medical workers in scrubs, sometimes in PPE, exhausted. We see sick people through plexiglass, sometimes with their loved ones on one side of it. We see pictures of mass graves dug in preparation for mass death. We see people gathered for physically distanced funerals, but we do not see Ebola 2014 style images that expose the fragility of those sickened by the disease, the blood, the scarcity of high-tech medical equipment. But as we know, Black death is always on display in the US in one way or another. And this tweet actually comes from Today. And Keela Hughes is a Twitter personality, comedian, podcast host, who had this to say about the kind of exhausting experience that many Black people face, which is that every time a Black person is murdered by police in this country, then there follow days of shared media. So she asks people to stop doing that, and she also reminds people that this is not innocent, that journalism is actually signaling to its reading public a certain message about this violence. So as many of you certainly know by now, yesterday, Memorial Day, another Black man, George Floyd, was murdered by a police officer, this time in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The video circulates as usual, and it comes on the heels of revelations about other police murders of Black folks. Ahmaud Arbery in February 2020, February this year in Glynn County, Georgia. Breonna Taylor in March 2020 in Louisville, Kentucky. Two men, Sean Reed and Mikhail Rose, were shot dead by police in Indianapolis just a couple of weeks ago. So what do these different examples have to do with each other? I would argue that they have everything to do with each other. If Black people are dying in Africa of Ebola or something else, it is perceived as the normal state of affairs. Nobody apart from families with relatives and loved ones in the affected places, professionals or scholars in the US cared about Ebola in 2014 until it appeared that the US might become a zone of transmission after a couple of cases landed here. Seeing death over there made little difference, and the images circulated freely. Black folks' deaths here in the US, however, can't be represented as collective or as part of a larger American whole. Instead, they are individualized, criminalized, separated from the historical and structural reasons for disproportionate numbers of Black people dying from COVID-19, and the disproportionate numbers of Black people dying at the hands of police. I want to end with some other kinds of images of Black folks, though, because survival is the work that Black folks have done and continue to do every day, even in the face of a state that has, more often than not, failed to create conditions for long, healthy lives, for realizing dreams, for raising children, for surviving. We see images of Black grief. We see images of Black protest and activism. We see images of Black workers, yes, essential workers, putting their bodies on the line so that they can feed their families and so that we can feed ours. In COVID-19, Black life and death looks like it always has, only the scale has changed. And this is what we must be attuned to always. Black folks are dying, to quote Sabrina Strings, because of slavery and its close companions, colonialism and capitalism. Masks, like silence, will not save us. This is not a call to stop wearing masks. Instead, it is to recognize that masks will be read differently by different people. The authoritarian impulse that leads a masked white woman to call the police on a Black man in New York who simply asked her to leash her dog tells me that she understands that her safety during COVID-19 is tied to her participation in a public health recommendation. But on a deeper and far more disturbing level, she understands her safety to be tied to her reliance on whiteness and its easy resort to police violence. Her mask is not innocent. And thankfully, the Black bird watcher, Christian Cooper, survived to tell us about it.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for that powerful presentation. I really appreciate you joining the program and talking about those topics. The university has been sending a lot of communications about essential research and supporting essential research at this time. And if your talk and the 3 talks tonight aren't essential research, I don't know what is at this moment. So I really appreciate this gathering. I'm going to open it up for a Q&A in just a second, but I want to do something that I have not done throughout this entire series, which is to thank the staff that has been putting it together behind the scenes. These productions are hard work, and they don't appear magically. And the people behind the scenes are just as passionate and professional about what they're doing as the people on the screen. So I'd particularly like to thank Joe Hyland, the Associate Director of the Arts and Humanities Council, Gerard Panacook, the Programs and Operations Coordinator, and Ethan Gill, our multimedia specialist, who does so much great work for the campus. So thank you, staff. Amazing work for the last 7 weeks or so. I really appreciate that. So just a few questions. We're running a little late, but there's a lot of important things I just want to ask you about. One sort of topic that came up again and again is forgetting in some way. And you're each historians, and I want to hear your thoughts about forgetting. And whenever we host one of these events, I realize how quickly and easily they provide context, historical context, and historical continuities and ways of getting a handle on the current moment that otherwise seems so chaotic and unprecedented. And just a little bit of remembering helps a long way in terms of knowledge and easing nerves and everything else. But we're dealing with willed forgetting in so many different ways at this moment. And I think that each of the presentations spoke to that. A friend of mine who was listening, pointed out that, it was the civil rights movement coincided with the rapid decline of civics classes, required American government courses, history requirements, all the stuff that could have been, preserved and passed on from civil rights. So I'm just kind of curious, the 3 of your historians in one way or another, and can you comment upon this sort of willed forgetting, or I think that Johannes called it total amnesia after the text that he was discussing before. How do you understand this? How do you understand the incredible lapse of memory about the issues and the histories and the people that you're talking about at this point in time? And how intentional do you understand that massive forgetting that we might be experiencing? Would anyone like to start with that?
I can start. I don't know about intentionality, and I'm definitely not a memory scholar, but what struck me, I started my talk by talking about the mask and what it was like 2 months ago, even, as we were all starting to just process the fact that we were about to face a pandemic. When classes broke up that week before spring break, I was pretty clear that, well, for myself, that I understood a certain set of guidelines had come out that said masks don't do anything, right? If you don't have the right kind of mask, and if you're not a carrier yourself, then don't worry about it. By the end of March, that had changed quite significantly, because increasingly people were pointing out that, well, people who had experience with other SARS outbreaks earlier in the 2000s, especially people from China and other parts of East Asia, understood quite clearly that the mask mattered, right? And it mattered for reasons that were beyond the biological transmission of the germs. It also mattered because it signaled a communal spirit, right? Mm-hmm. And so in thinking about what all that meant, then I also had to come to terms with some of my own blinders around, why it was that I had never thought about the logic of wearing the mask, even though I've seen people wearing them on campus, right, all the time. And so I think, tying back into Ellen's talk, hopefully, it's important to call out the fact that people, I think, maybe forgot about the importance of the mask because they were prone to not thinking that people from China or other parts of Asia knew what they were doing, when in fact they did know what they were doing, right? And that cost us time, in addition to all of the other failings of our government. So that recognition of the connection between the failure to recognize the importance of the communal spirit and the fundamentally racist inability to process the fact that people from China might have some sense about this was a massive failing, right? And memory, I think, does have something to do with that. But I'm sure there are people who can speak to that with more authority than I can.
Ellen or Johannes, would you like to weigh in on this issue?
I mean, I can, yeah.
Go ahead, Johannes.
No, you should go ahead, please.
I was just gonna start talking and see what just ends up coming out. I mean, so I appreciate what Michelle was just saying, and yeah, I really, this concept of total amnesia really intrigues me. I mean, I guess my first reaction to your question, Ed, was just, I think just different people, different individuals, different communities have, I guess, they're able to forget. They have a freedom of forgetting in ways that others might not have. Just when Michelle was talking, for instance, this reminded me of a work that a friend of mine who is actually an IU grad, Rayshawn Ray, a sociologist, who's been talking a lot about Black men or Black people and running, and how they don't just like go out for a run, but they might like have to dress a certain way, maybe wearing like a college alumni shirt or carry certain kinds of ID. Like they can't forget that, because that actually could be a life and death matter, right? So that was my first reaction, just thinking like I just think different communities have different relationships to and freedom to forget.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Johannes, any thoughts? Yes.
Yes, so there's a whole, I mean, I think, to say something very general, I think that our world is characterized by an incredible amount of forgetting. So on the one hand, we live in a more complicated world mm-hmm. than, in a long time. At the same time, there's a lot of forgetting that, in fact, deforms the information we get. So to give you one example, what is interesting is that for political reasons, because the World Health Organization cannot represent and accept Taiwan as a separate member, Taiwan was one of the most successful countries in mitigating the impact and preventing, in fact, an outbreak, really, in spite of its proximity to China and the traffic there. So that's one thing, that it doesn't appear in the World Health Organization, because the World Health Organization is just there as strong as its members are and their agreements are. They rely on others' data and so on. But it's a second step that most Western governments, in fact, don't know that, or seem to have forgotten it, right? So there's whole parts of the reality of how institutions work, how histories work, that is completely absent, right? And another good example for this, but they're maybe politically too neutral, is that there were two major flu epidemics, pandemics, after the Spanish flu, which is the so-called Asian flu in 1957, and the so-called Hong Kong flu, which are all bad names because they in a way designate, just as the Spanish flu that most likely originated in North America, in a way an origin. So I think it's very complicated, and the stories with the racial, that's also extremely interesting, how in fact this disintegrating moment of the disease makes us aware in how incapable we are, in fact, to really hold together all the different stories, I think, that play into this and that are somehow, in a way, become visible through the disintegrating effect of the pandemic that it has on many different things. And of course, governments are less able than in decades probably to encounter this, or maybe societies are as well. But the solidarity question and what Michelle said was really interesting to me. That's not sure if that's helpful. It was a bit general.
No, it is. And what your comment leads to a second sort of general topic that emerged. It has to do with visibility and invisibility, and the ways in which sort of public structures or sort of public protocols of being seen and not being seen are shifting, not just because of masks and masking, but reasons to be out and about or to be quarantined, self-quarantined or otherwise. All of this is sort of really raising and tweaking these questions of the visible and the invisible. And I'm kind of curious about, in this, how communities, particularly communities that have been targets of violence in the past, what strategies are being developed to deal with this new, sort of crisis. Someone wrote, and I thought it was really an interesting comment, a question specifically for Ellen, but I think any of you could talk about this. Mentioned an Indigenous woman, Dakota Holmes, who was assaulted when she sneezed in public in Vancouver on May 15th. She was misidentified by her assailant as Asian and blamed for spreading COVID-19. Can you speak to the intersection here of anti-Asian racism and particularly Indigenous erasure? And what we choose to see and not see, what we missee intentionally or not. And I'm just wondering about the ways in which the communities that you've been addressing deal with this. And I think it's a kind of interesting theoretical question also for Johannes in terms of the politics about citizens that are seen or not seen, or recognized or not recognized by the state at these moments. So I know it's a big, weighty question, but it would be nice to hear your thoughts a little bit about negotiating visibility and invisibility as a citizen, at a problematic moment such as this one.
Okay, I guess I'll jump in. I'll try to be concise, Ed. Yeah. There's this interesting thing where, at least among Asian Americans, how people always get confused for somebody else, right? Like people just assume you're Chinese even if you're not, or whatever. And but at least the Asian American folks I've been sort of either listening to or talking to during this time, most of it virtually, of course. I think there's definitely a segment of Asian Americans who understand that Asian Americans sort of position in US society is like relational, right? So, and a lot of times the things that we have enjoyed as sort of like privileges or benefits have come at the expense of other communities. So, you know, in my own research on like Hawaii, for instance, Asian Americans there in the 20th, you know, middle of the 20th century were celebrated as like becoming really successful, and they did gain more and more political power, but that did come at the cost of Native disenfranchisement and, you know, what humanists call settler colonialism, right? And those sort of processes. So what am I trying to say? So I think Asian Americans, at least some of the folks I've been talking to, are trying to figure out like, yeah, it kind of sucks right now, but we also know that the deeper sort of most urgent problems are those, I think, the ones that like Michelle talked about that are impacting Black communities, Native communities. And so in this moment, we're asking how can we be good allies and sort of make sure that those issues get the attention that they really do need.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I can say a very small thing. I read the article that Michelle quoted at the very end, and I was very impressed by it. You know, the slavery, it's slavery. And what I was very impressed by, in fact, is that she says, look, there is a difference of 7 percentage points between obesity in the white population and in the African-American population, but there's a 200-something% point difference in how many people actually die of COVID-19. So that in fact, what we see in the media that people say, well, pre-existing conditions, obesity being the first one, is in fact covering something, right? And so that reminded me really of the urgency of really profound media as well as of profound academic work. Because obviously, in spite of, and that's just probably the visible, in spite of there being so many data around right now, and we all seem to know what we see, you know, and we're told, well, it's this and that statistics. In fact, we need very intelligent research and interpretation in order to understand that a lot of what we see is actually not what is the case. Mm-hmm. So that was for me really a wake-up call. I was really impressed, you know, as I was by the presentations, but that article was
I think I would just add in terms of I don't know, maybe we can call it hyper invisibility in terms of the Native and Indigenous experience of COVID. I mean, it's been a while since I've read this or seen it, but the racial disparities, health disparities data that's come out doesn't even account for Native Americans, right? I mean, they're according to the numbers we have, they're not dying, but they are. We know that from specific cases like the Navajo Nation, which has been somewhat more widely reported on. But it's a feature of the way that statistics are collected, I guess, and perhaps has to do with the relationships between tribes and the US government. But there just aren't any there are no statistics, right? So that is a kind of invisibility that is especially egregious given what we know is happening based on the, you know, sort of spot reporting that's happening. And also what we know in general about health disparities for people of color in this country. So, so I just wanted to put that in because I think it's really important to, I wish that I had more specifics and references, but it's been within the last month for sure that I saw information on this, and it's really disturbing.
My last question, and we have to stop soon. It comes out of Johannes's talk, particularly about the ways in which it clarifies the role that the state plays in relationship to immunity. granting immunity, withholding immunity, all the different ways in which that arrangement can be staged, particularly as immunity is something that grants community and communication, or guarantees it. I think you use the word guarantees. I'm curious about, resistance to the state at this moment in the different groups that we're talking about. And oddly, and I really hate bringing this up, but I'm just wondering about like anti-vaxxers, and particularly anti-mask movement participants. Groups that refuse to participate in perhaps state-sanctioned immunity in some way, and really what's happening to the possibilities of dissent, at this moment in relationship to the state under COVID-19. Where do we find pockets of critique and resistance in the public, and how do we understand them at this moment? Because it's a genuine question on my part. I mean, genuinely baffled by what's happening. But I'm just kind of curious, from the three perspectives that were put forward tonight, what do you think about the movements that have been getting attention as resistant? What do you think other groups are doing in response? Where can we look for interesting models of this, productive models? So anyway, at this late hour, if anyone's willing to chew on that for a second, I'd really love to hear your thoughts.
I can chew on it for a second, but
yeah, thanks, Johannes.
So, I mean, there has always been a resistance to vaccination from the beginning. In the beginning, it was the Catholic Church, actually, especially in the 18th century, that actually says, well, if you vaccinate, you take destiny out of God's hand. So he determines, when you get the disease. And later on, it took the different shape. Many alternative circles actually have the idea not just of vaccines as being potentially damaging, which is for most of them not true, but empirically. But I think what is in a way masked, or what lies behind them, is that there's a form of life that is in a way shaped. And there are vaccine critics that, for example, say, well, certain children's diseases are just part of developmental steps, right? So in other words, you mature in this psychobiological realm if you go through a certain disease. And so for especially the more mild and less dangerous children's diseases, that is quite widespread in some parts of the world. So I think that shows that there's something really essential political at stake, which is the way we live together in a community, in the question of vaccination and how we, what we expose ourselves to and how we are with others. I think in the current moment, it's really hard, and I think that actually, so we have worldwide really a crisis, political crisis, I think, in many parts of the world in terms of the governments that are in charge. So there would be a lot of reason to criticize. At the same time, this seemingly inevitable pandemic seems to take the wind out of all sails. And I think that is a bit the responsibility of politicians, because while I think there is good reason to listen really carefully to epidemiologists, to medical personnel, I also think that the giving in entirely, the giving over, in a way, regulatory capacity to them, especially if you have solid, good government institutions, is a mistake in public discourse. Because in fact, many things are a matter of decision, right? And we could learn from, say, Taiwan and some other countries that certain things can stay open, not just in Sweden, which is now criticized, but also in Taiwan, and I think in Singapore, schools have been open throughout and they did not experience spikes in infection. So actually there was an unwillingness to learn, but then there was also no public discussion. It is possible to react in a differential way to risks that does not close down everything. And in the end, I think the lack of that public debate then allowed some right-wing fringe groups, to come in and say, hey, our freedom rights are not respected, which I think is profoundly misguided and endangering others. At the same time, I think that the truth, let's say the problem that points to symptomatically is that there hasn't been enough open debate by most leaders, in that there are alternatives. There's no alternative to reacting, but there can be an educated debate. So actually, I think leaders have a lack of trust in the populations also to understand and discuss these things, while some reactions need to be fast. So I think those are my two.
Thank you.
I mean, I think just in terms of other kinds of resistance and what's viable, mutual aid is the most clear instance to me of what's happening now that is a form of resistance, because it's just refusing to stop in the face of a state that says, too bad, right? Like people are mobilized and they're helping each other. The other one I think that's worth pointing to, and I intended to say this during your question about visibility and invisibility, is the prison abolition activism, and the spotlight that those kinds of activists have been able to put on conditions in prisons, and particularly the fact that prisons have become COVID hotspots, and that the people who are incarcerated there have no chance, right? And so I've seen less on it lately, but it certainly late March, early April, there was quite a bit of discussion of releasing incarcerated people who, so that they had a chance to survive, but and also to try and inhibit the making of prisons into COVID hotspots.
I won't speak too long, but I'll just add just one more example, I guess, to this, which I feel really grateful right now for like disability activists, and I just sort of eavesdrop on them, I guess, like online and stuff on Twitter, and I feel like a lot of the issues we're confronting now in terms of accessibility and technology and the worth of the human body, right? Each human body, each human person. I feel like the disability activists have been already thinking about all this stuff for a very long time, and maybe we haven't all stopped to listen to them. And so I find that sort of comforting, there's these really smart people that are sort of ahead of us, in light years, really. And we just got to keep listening to them and following their lead.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. I mean, those are three very satisfying answers. So I appreciate your taking the time to respond. Two things, as always, these conversations, they go too late, which just makes me think that they're important and there's a lot more to discuss. And I hope that the council can continue to pick these up, and maybe later in the summer. And then also, I really have to say, when we're tallying despair and hope, I always find myself at the end of these feeling really grateful for my colleagues for providing really interesting and productive histories and alternatives, and kind of revealing pockets of our culture and society that are moving forward in really productive ways. So, and I appreciate you all for doing that today. You've given us a lot to think about. I'll just say in conclusion, although this is the last installment of Quarantine Conversations, at least in this iteration, both campuses, IU and IUPUI, are offering plenty of live stream programming over the summer. Our Thursdays at Home series will stream every other week beginning June 4th, where we present a lot of fun performances and readings from IU artists and humanists. And the Department of Theater, Drama, and Contemporary Dance will present Theater Thursdays on alternate weeks beginning this Thursday. We're also waiting to hear more from IU Cinema about their summer programming. So there's a lot of stuff going on. And, you know, as we've been saying all along, the arts and humanities community at IU is still thriving and still very productive and still looking to share their work with the world. So, you know, please keep in tune for those programs. Check out the calendar on our website and follow us on social media for more information about all these programs. Beyond that, I just want to thank my guests one last time. I appreciate your time, professors. I appreciate your willingness to lend your thoughts and ideas and work with us. Thank you so much, and I wish you the best in the coming weeks. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.